Welcome everybody. In the next couple of minutes, I will talk about the effect of sweet beverages on the cortisol stress response after fasting. Many of you may be familiar with the stress response. It is triggered when we are exposed to threat, and it leads to the release of adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream. These hormones increase our blood glucose levels, so in the end, the stress response provides us with enough energy to fight or flight. 2 decades ago, a research group discovered that the cortisol stress response might be dependent on blood glucose levels. They observed that fasted participants with low blood glucose levels did not show the expected rise in cortisol in response to stress. If people consumed sugar prior to the stressor, the response was remarkably increased. Furthermore, the blood glucose increase in response to the drink was positively associated with the cortisol stress response. Thus, the more glucose there was, the more cortisol was released into the system. The group could replicate the findings, showing that only sugar, but neither fat or protein or other complex sugars prior to stress could increase the cortisol stress response after fasting. They concluded that the stress response might be dependent on blood glucose levels. However, besides the rise in blood glucose levels that sugar triggers, sugar has another distinct feature which was not controlled for in previous studies. It is sweet. To find out the role of sweetness, we added a group to the original study design. This group consumed sweetener, stevia, a compound that binds to the sweet taste receptor. However, it does not provide an energy load. As part of a larger research project investigating women, we screened participants for several exclusion criteria that would infer that the physiological stress response and invited eligible participants to our lab after an overnight fast of at least 8 hours. So blood glucose levels were low when participants came into the lab. Then participants received a beverage containing either sugar or stevia or plain water. After that, participants were exposed to the triasocial stress test for groups. Throughout the experiment, we collected saliva for cortisol detection and blood glucose samples. Previous research suggested that sugar load prior to stress leads to an increased cortisol response compared to water and stevia. Further, prior results showed that blood glucose levels are positively associated with the cortisol stress response. To replicate and expand these findings, we looked at the data of the 3 groups stevia, sugar, and water. As expected, we saw a significant increase in blood glucose levels after sugar, but not after stevia or water load. Also, we successfully induced subjective stress in all 3 study groups without group differences between the experimental conditions. When looking at the cortisol trajectories over time, we found a significant group-by-time interaction. Specifically, sugar and stevia load prior to stress led to an increased cortisol stress response compared to water. Remarkably, cortisol responses in the sugar and stevia group were not significantly different from each other. This is also reflected in the scatter plot, which shows that blood glucose changes after drink consumption were not related to the cortisol stress response. Overall, we conclude that sweet drinks lead to an increased cortisol stress response after fasting. This association is independent of blood glucose levels, a finding that is not in line with previous research, but further supports recent findings questioning the linear relationship between blood glucose levels and the cortisol stress response. There are certainly some weaknesses of our study that need to be considered when interpreting our results. Further, future studies will have to determine potential mechanisms that could explain our findings. Here, we think it might be promising to look at the role of the sweet taste receptor and metabolic or reward-related processes that are triggered by its activation. For now, I want you to keep in mind that it might be all about the sweetness, not about the energy. With this being said, I want to thank the students of the Team Sugar and my working group in Constance. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions. See you soon.